Good afternoon, everyone. I want to welcome members of the public, members of the task force, and others that have joined us today. This is a meeting of the Florida HAB Task Force. This is a virtual half-day meeting. And before we get started, I just wanted to mention that the meeting is being streamed on FWC's YouTube channel. I also wanted to mention that we'll have a public comment period at 2:30. We will post a call-in number at that time, but comments may also be submitted in writing through the online form that's available at myfwc.com/HAB taskforce. And with that, before we get started in the meeting, I will go ahead and do roll call. We do have a few members missing today, so I'm not going to call their names, but I will call the names of the members that are here. Don Anderson.
Here.
Emily Cooley.
Here.
Wayne DeFries.
Here.
Quay Dortch.
Here.
Charles Jacoby.
Here.
Michelle Smith.
Here.
Rhonda Watkins.
Here.
Great. And then our members, Dave Whiting, Barbara Kirkpatrick, and Sherry Larkin were unable to attend today, so they send their regrets. So just to get started today, we will start out per normal with our roundtable updates, including an overview of what's going on with blooms right now. And then we'll have a continued discussion of some of the priority topics that we've identified in prior task force meetings. And to really hone in on those, we'll focus primarily on nutrients in red tide and some of the progress that's been made there. Some of the discussion and movement in the red tide treatment and mitigation arena. And then also some of the ongoing discussion about how the task force moves to think about HABs beyond red tide with a focus on continuing to think about the primer that we've mentioned in prior meetings. I apologize, I'm recovering from bronchitis, so it is what it is, but I may cough a little bit, and again, I apologize in advance. Okay, so I'm going to go ahead and kick things off with a bloom update. And let me share my screen. Great, okay. Okay, hopefully everyone can see that. And so I wanted to give a quick update just to kind of go back in time a little bit, but we did have a Corynea brevis bloom last year that started in September of 2024 and extended through February. That bloom obviously has subsided, and this bloom overall was a 6-month bloom, and it was restricted primarily to South Florida. Right now, in terms of where we're at, usually blooms start in late summer or fall, and we're a little bit too early out to forecast the next bloom, at least based on some of the different kinds of conditions we look for, including the position and strength of the loop current. So I just wanted to give a quick update on Corynea. I also wanted to mention that we have updated our website. This is part of some different upgrades that we had mentioned in previous meetings that were necessary for our GIS mapping tool. And so I'm happy to report that we have progress. This is not what the current map looks like, but we've made some changes so that now we are ADA compliant and again using a modernized GIS framework. So that is helpful, and we'll be working through different visualization options as we go. So this is an evolving process, an evolving map. I know that there's been some requests, for example, to include data streams like the IFCB cruise data. And so again, trying to get this database upgraded was one of the hurdles. And we still have some other hurdles to go yet with data management, but I just wanted to share this. And we have a blossoming FWC Center for Red Tide Research website. So this is something that we are working on continuing to flesh out. But I just wanted to mention this again in the vein of updating some of our different web resources. And this is what the recent map looks like without Carenia brevis. Sorry, jumping back to the daily map. And for the Carenia brevis map, this is a rolling 8-day map of the most recent 8 days of sampling. And we also now have a Pyridinium bahamense map. Pyridinium bahamense is related to saxitoxin production, and so we carefully monitor for this organism throughout the state. It is a typical summer bloomer in some of our estuaries like Old Tampa Bay, and I'll show that in just a second, and in Charlotte Harbor and in the Indian River Lagoon. We've also paid increased attention on pyridinium in these areas shown kind of in the pink color. Those areas are the scallop management zones. And so we're getting ready for summertime scallop season. And there are different zones, timings associated with each of these little subregions or zones delineated here. And so again, keeping a close watch, and you can see pyridinium is starting to kick up. And so carefully watching those levels and doing testing. We didn't have a pyridinium bloom in Old Tampa Bay, and Carrie Lopez has been, this was last year, apologies. And so Carrie Lopez has been working with partners at Hillsborough County as well as the Tampa Bay Estuary Program on a project to map out cyst distribution and to kind of understand if there may be some sort of connection where fewer cysts lead to less dense or maybe even no bloom. And I'm gonna invite her to speak more about those results at a future meeting. But I just wanted to share that indeed we did see a decrease in cyst abundance, and that seemed to extend into this year as well. And so what that means for the Old Tampa Bay blooms relative to what we're seeing on the coast, it's hard to say, but we are in that window of enhanced pyridinium monitoring. And then this is just kind of a zoom in on areas that are important for shellfish management. So there are open, or not open, but there are shellfish harvesting areas in the IRL, in Pine Island Sound, and in these scallop zones. And then this just popped up, but we are also watching a localized brown tide event in the Mosquito Lagoon. We're continuing to track this with a number of partners. Samples collected in May had approximately 4 times the bloom threshold for Orion-Lake cells. That's based on light microscopy. But we've also been able to do antibody-based imaging flow cytometry. This is in the lab, and that allows us to pull these very difficult to identify cells that are Orion lagunensis out of a mixed population, and basically fluorescently tag them and run them through the flow cytometer. And so this has been really great in terms of getting this approach and methodology into the framework for some more real-time analysis so that we have results, these sort of definitive results more quickly. So exciting on the tech front, not so exciting to have actual brown tide in the field. We're happy to work with it in the lab. And then I also just wanted to mention a little bit about sargassum. This is forecasted to be a bad sargassum year. We're keeping a close watch on conditions. There have been already some landings on Florida coasts, and so we can watch these events across great distances in the ocean, and essentially the sargassum can get pulled into the Gulf of Mexico, into the loop current, and then make its way around the southern tip of Florida and up the East Coast. However, in addition to landing on the East Coast, it can land in North Florida and it can go to Texas and other parts of the Gulf. So the loop current can kind of help distribute it. And you can see from this fluorescence data that there are a few pretty intense patches out there that we're keeping an eye on. And this is just kind of a zoomed in patch that shows you a little bit further out. And again, you can see into the loop current, and this is a zoomed in image. It's a 7-day composite through yesterday. And it just gives you that sort of fine scale detail in terms of where sargassum is. And it's pretty impressive to think about given the scale that we're talking about. And these are all products that are available through Chuan Min Hu's Optical Oceanography Laboratory at University of South Florida. This kind of information is compiled into these inundation risk forecasts. And so this is an experimental product, and it's put out in collaboration by NASA, NOAA, and the University of South Florida. And it takes that remote sensing data and translates it into kind of the inundation risk. And so what we're seeing is that, there are a few areas that are forecasted to be to have landfall and have inundation along the East Coast. And there has been momentum of East Coast counties to start planning to have more regular check-ins to help prepare and stage for this. And whatever may transpire later in the season. Typically, the peak months are more in summer, so typically June, July. And sargassum can cause a lot of different issues once it lands on the beach in terms of disposal. And so each county kind of manages a little bit differently, but a few years ago when a really big sargassum event was forecasted, this big county group started to meet to try to come up with a more consolidated response. So I just wanted to share this because again, it's something that is ongoing and it is in the media. And with that, I'll stop sharing bloom updates, and I'll see if there's any questions from the task force. And I'm just trying to stop my PowerPoint. There we go. Yeah, I think, Rhonda, I see you have a 1. Quay, I see you next. Rhonda?
Thanks, Kate. 2 questions. One, are we going to include pseudonychia on those maps, since those are the top 3 that we seem to monitor? And any updates on the spinning fish in the Keys?
Yeah, so in terms of pseudonychia maps, we prioritized Crynia and Pyridinium, but the goal is to have a pseudonychia map. I will show some slides, I think, when we talk about some of the other HABs, but pseudonychia is a different sort of communication challenge because it's so ubiquitous in Florida, and so I think that we have to be mindful that if we start sharing a map of pseudonychia data, it's going to look a little bit different just because it's almost always prevalent in samples, and trying to convey the message that even though it's present but not necessarily harmful is a difficult one, and potentially involves a few different layers to get there. But pseudonychia is, it is on the list as well. And hopefully this is something that could potentially be used to map other HAB events and data.
Okay, thank you.
Clay?
Before I ask my question, I'll second your caution about the pseudonychia because, Louisiana had pseudonychia numbers that elsewhere would have triggered every kind of event response imaginable, and yet no events. And so it makes it really hard to manage. Anyway, I had two questions. Let's see if I can remember them both. One was I assume up in the areas where you're now monitoring for the pyridinium, have you found any toxicity in the shellfish yet? Or is that something you all don't know yet?
We have found a little bit, but it's well below regulatory levels. So we're continuing to obviously monitor that really closely and have kind of an improved monitoring strategy. Each year we learn from our mistakes the prior year and get more data to inform kind of how we approach the next year's sampling.
Do you do people in Florida eat the whole scallop, or just is it a bay scallop that they just eat the muscle?
It depends. I think most people just eat the muscle, but some people will eat the whole scallop.
And have you checked that that the muscle remains free of toxin as it does up in New England?
Last year, we did do some preliminary screening for that, and I think additional work is needed. But I don't think it's quite as clear cut as it is in New England, unfortunately.
That's too bad. Unfortunately, I have forgotten my second question. If I remember it, I will. I didn't write them down.
Well, I didn't answer Rhonda's second question, so maybe while I go back to Rhonda's second question and Don keeps track of his question, you can think about your question. But in terms of the spinning fish update, Rhonda, I don't have a lot of new information other than the levels. We continued to do monitoring for gamberdiscus with partners, FGCU namely, and we didn't see the same levels of gamberdiscus this year that we saw last year. There were a few reports of spinning fish as well as impacts on sawfish, but numbers were greatly reduced relative to last year. So that's kind of the update. We're still working through a lot of different lines of inquiry to kind of come up with maybe a better working hypothesis that is more nuanced than a Ciguatera event.
Okay, thanks. I would imagine there's still samples that are probably being analyzed from the last event. Tissue samples
There are
and stuff.
samples and there's experimental samples, and sometimes a lot of these investigations, especially with some of the pathology, you kind of go step by step and you learn from this, and then you say, okay, now I need to build in this expertise. And so it's definitely an interesting process. And as the algae person, I'm kind of watching that and somewhat peripheral to it, but it is very interesting to be a part of a response like this and to see the detail and the work that goes into really making these assessments.
Thank you.
Thanks, Rhonda. Don?
Actually, I forgot my question. No,
I told you to remember it.
I'm just kidding. On the sargassum, I just looking for somebody to clarify something for me. I have heard that the problem with managing it through booming has something to do with, I guess, endangered species, or it's a habitat for a lot of organisms. How much is booming used in Florida or not used, and why? I guess is the question. To keep
sargassum?
to keep the sargassum from getting to the beaches or the harbors.
That's not used at all because of, I think, federal protections for sea turtles.
That's what it is. It's okay. because that's one wonders whether a blanket prohibition of something like that, is justified all the time and everywhere and so forth. And you wonder whether the counties and the cities could get a better management response through booming if that federal regulation could somehow be looked into. And it looks like Quay can comment on this.
To the extent that this is a subject of, and all methods of mitigating, as long as it's in the water, it's considered essential fish habitat, not just turtles, but essential fish habitat. Right. And so it's a matter of considerable debate right now within NOAA how you deal with something. And I just heard recently, and I wish I could remember the specifics, of a solution that everybody had agreed to. I don't know. I'm on the periphery of this discussion, so I just hear about it indirectly. So they realize that there is a real serious problem here.
Mm-hmm.
And then there's the other issue that, all of those rules were based on the fact that there was just the sargassum in the Sargasso Sea. Now that there is so much more sargassum, which means so much more essential fish habitat, what's happening with all the fish stocks and the turtle stocks now that there is, and does it have any effect on the numbers of eventually adult fish and adult turtles to have this patch that's somewhere else that's not part of their life cycle? So there's a lot of discussion going on right now that I just barely touched on.
Mm-hmm.
So that's definitely an evolving topic, as we just said. I think that from a few different perspectives, and including the tracking of this sort of offshore phenomenon through the loop current, there's some interesting parallels in terms of trying to connect some of the different phenomena that we think are important for red tide, including things like dust deposition and even the balance as we move into storm season. There's a lot of these different sort of large scale phenomena that can come into play. But yeah, the idea of whether or not it could be a good thing, it's definitely a weird one, very, very nuanced.
And the federal government doesn't deal with nuance very well.
State, maybe government in general.
Yeah.
Okay, well, so that was just an overview of some of the different things going on, and we are also in cyanobacteria season. I'm not going to give an update on what's going on in our freshwater systems, but we are continuing to keep an eye on some of the benthic algae, and so we have some monitoring that should be happening this month in some of the areas that have been impacted over the past few years from different benthic cyanobacteria blooms. So that's an ongoing area. Okay, so we are going to move away from our bloom update, and we are going to give some here's some updates from our working groups and related programs. And before I turn it over to our working groups, I'll give an update from Dave Whiting for DEP. He mentioned that DEP is working with both RTI and SAS to develop a forecasting tool for freshwater HABs in lakes that are large enough to be observed by the Sentinel-3 satellite. And so there's a project that will wrap up by the end of June that should provide a running 7-day probability of a bloom for each water body, or within some of the larger lakes, some of the assessment zones. And so that might be helpful for directing sampling and mitigation activities going forward. So that's kind of a neat development, and maybe we can ask Dave more about that when he comes back for a future meeting. And without further ado, I'll turn things over to Emily to give an update on the HAB Health Working Group. Emily?
Thanks, Kate. Can everybody hear me okay? Okay, good. Yes, so the last HAB Health Working Group meeting that we had actually occurred pretty much directly after the last task force meeting, so I'll update anything that happened since then. In the last meeting and since the last meeting, we've been working on a blue-green algae and red tide occupational health guidance documents. The working group has done a pretty extensive review, and then we got epidemiology staff to do a deep dive into the occupational documents as well. And those are currently routed with FDOH communications and executive leadership. So it's working its way through the system, and hopefully those become final approved documents that can go out to the public soon. And so hopefully by the next meeting, I can share those. But right now they're still in draft routing through FDOH. Another big thing that the HAB Health Working Group has been working on is a healthcare provider training for HABs in Florida. We're kind of basing it off of a training that came out of a group called the Association of State and Territorial Health Officials, or ASTHO. They have a training out there for healthcare professionals and clinical staff for HABs, but it's kind of more an overall training for all of the United States. And so we kind of took a snapshot of the way that they organize their training and the way that they have their modules, and we're breaking it down and making it a little bit more Florida specific. And so the staff at FDOH, a couple of us and some EPI staff have been working behind the scenes to get that a little bit more put together and organized. We're pretty close to our final draft of the blue-green algae healthcare provider training. And we're also going to make a separate one for red tide. And so in this next HAB Health Working Group meeting, which is actually happening this Thursday, the group is going to deep dive into a little bit more case specific questions that they can help provide the doctors to be able to ask their patients to help determine if they've potentially been exposed to harmful algal blooms. And then we have a veterinarian with FDOH who's on the HAB Health Working Group, Dr. Sherry Casper, and so she's in the group. We've invited a couple of our epidemiology staff members so that we can get a better perspective on the human health side, since I'm more of the environmental public health side. And so we can really get a good idea of what hopefully the doctors are expecting, and what we can provide in the training that would be beneficial for them. And so we have our last meeting, like I said, Thursday. I've already submitted everything for the group to continue next year, but as we know, we're all waiting on budget approval. So we'll see if that goes through, then we'll continue the HAB Health Working Group next fiscal year as well. And I think that's it for right now.
Thanks, Emily. Lots of progress there. Any questions for Emily? All right. Thanks, Emily. Now I will turn it over to Chuck, who will give an update from the HAB Communications Working Group. Chuck?
Thank you. So the pet health and red tide video should be out shortly. Megan is the keeper of such information, but there's English and Spanish versions with the snippets, the cut downs also created. They were last being checked for ADA compliance. We are gonna go ahead and try to push out the letter that Rhonda started, which deals with kind of a look at the FAQs that are around the place. And basically the letter will point out some inconsistencies for the people to understand, and then pretty much always direct them back to FWC as the source of the most up-to-date information. So that necessarily puts the onus on FWC and anybody else who's contributing to keep the information up to date. The nutrients and red tide video, which is the one that was in the queue next, we're going to hold off until we get a look at the white paper to see what that tells us. Certainly the symposium, which you'll hear a lot more about, was bit of an eye-opener in some cases. So a couple of comms issues for me. Seem to be pretty uneven knowledge of what is out there, as it were, known and unknown. And I think the ultimate answer to Karenia and its interaction with nutrients is it's going to be it depends, but we'll have to figure out how to make that a little bit more helpful, which I think we can do. Anyway. I'm not 100% sure that it was a lot of help to guide the grant program. Seemed to run the gamut from anything about red tide to things that are pretty focused on the management. So I think, again, I think the key, for me anyway, for the granting program is to kind of think of it as a coherent program that tries to move things forward rather than necessarily chasing every possible silver bullet that people put forward. So yeah, I'd be certainly trying to carefully watch the white paper to see where that takes us. I mean, it was a brainstorming session, so there was a lot of information floating around in the atmosphere. Let's see. Will be a survey that'll go out, in this case, to the consumers of seafood. That would then hopefully guide some of the questions that would go to the restaurants and seafood industry in terms of how information about red tide or lack of information about red tide or misinformation about red tide affects their businesses. And the work group is looking for members. We meet in July.
And we, thanks, Chuck. Any questions for Chuck? And just as a note, we will have some additional time to discuss the nutrient SOS. So I think we can kind of focus that discussion in just a little while. Okay.
So Megan put an update on the video in the chat for those who aren't following their chats.
Well, thank you. Thank you to Chuck and Emily for those updates, and to the members of those working groups. And I think Chuck set things up pretty nicely for Betty, who will give an overview of the nutrient state of the science that Sea Grant recently held, as well as some of the next steps. So without further ado, Betty, thank you so much for joining us today.
Thanks. Okay, let me share my screen. Okay, can you see that?
Yep, it looks great.
Perfect. All right, so yeah, my name's Betty Stogler. I'm with Florida Sea Grant, and it's my pleasure to provide this update on the Nutrients in Red Tide in Florida State of the Science Symposium. The symposium was held April 21 through 23, 2025 at the USF St. Pete University Student Center. And we implemented this symposium over 2.5 days, beginning at 1 p.m. on Monday, because we wanted to allow for travel since Easter was the day before. We had 47 registered attendees participate in the symposium, and I was really pleased that the overwhelming majority of them participated all 3 days. Additionally, we had 8 facilitators and note takers, and Lisa Krimsky and myself as symposium chairs, for a grand total of 57 people in the room. As far as where participants or who they represented, it was pretty well split, with the lion's share coming from academia or a government agency, and smaller participation from non-governmental organizations and regional programs such as the estuary programs. And while most of our participants resided and worked in Florida, we did have out-of-state participation from 10 attendees, and I list the organizations they represented on the bottom left. All right, so our goal was to synthesize the current state of knowledge and efforts to identify and prioritize knowledge gaps regarding the role and contribution of nutrients and red tide events to guide further studies. And this was not only our goal, but it was our mandate. This was what this task force wanted, and that was relayed through FWRI when they asked us to put together this symposium. And to help us achieve this goal, we relied on 2 committees. So our steering committee was tasked with developing objectives for the symposium that would help us accomplish our goal. They also were tasked with developing a process for achieving those objectives, and they helped us ensure that we had the right people in the room. Our technical advisory committee was tasked with developing themes for meeting the objectives and identifying the type of content to be presented in those themes, as well as content experts for presenting that information. And I will mention there was a lot of overlap between the 2 committees, particularly as we got closer to the symposium. So this was our final objectives. Objective 1, encourage interdisciplinary collaboration and dialogue. This really set the stage for allowing us to accomplish objectives 2, 3, and 4. Objective 2, synthesize the current state of knowledge and efforts with regards to, these are the 3 themes that the TAC came up with: nutrient dynamics across bloom stages, tracking nutrients through systems, and management and response. And these were our broad session themes. The third objective, again, speaks directly to the goal: identify and prioritize short and long-term research needs and strategies. And here we defined short-term as 1 to 5 years and long-term as 5 to 10 years. And then our final objective, which was a pretty tall task, was identify connections to local, regional, and state management and policy interventions. And we really, I think we added this, and this was, again, at the direction of the steering committee, recognizing that we really needed to take advantage of the broad expertise that we had in the room and make steps here. All right, so a look at how we went through these 3 different thematic sessions. Starting with session 1, which was nutrient dynamics across bloom stages. We started with 2 longer synthesis talks, one focusing on historic research related to nutrient dynamics in bloom stages, and then the second moving us into some contemporary research. We then had a series of 5-minute lightning talks, and these lightning talks were prescribed, so we provided slides and asked speakers, even though they were focusing on different aspects of nutrient dynamics across bloom stages, to cover specific things on each slide, so that we made sure that we were getting the information that we needed, and also to help them be able to accomplish their talks in 5 minutes. All of our talks finished with a panel Q&A, And then Joy Hazel, our lead facilitator, led us through some whole group discussion around 3 questions. What do we need to know? Or excuse me, what do we know? What do we need to know? And why don't we know it? And we did this by bloom stage. So initiation, growth and maintenance, and then termination. And then at the conclusion of this, we broke the room into smaller breakout groups. These were pre-assigned, and they were tasked with taking a subset of the what do we need to know and developing research need statements. When they came back, the note takers reported out for the breakout groups, and then Joy led the room back through an exercise to assess across all of the research need statements for similarities and dependencies. And before I move on, these little numbers that you see next to each of the lines, those are referring to the objectives that we were targeting with each of these activities. All right, our second theme was tracking nutrients through systems, and the process that we used was identical to the first session. The major changes, of course, was the topic and the presenters. This session went quite a bit faster because we had fewer talks, only one synthesis talk, and this one talked about nutrients through estuaries. And then we had 3 5-minute lightning talks, again prescribed with slides provided. And then our whole group discussion was just the single, what do we know, what do we need to know, why don't we know it? We didn't have to do this through the different bloom stages. And what you're looking at here in this picture is Joy leading that group through the assessment of the research needs statements by similarities and dependencies. And what I mean by similarities and dependencies is similarities meaning that they're close enough that they could be linked together, and dependencies being that a research need is dependent on another research need being accomplished before it could be accomplished. So our third session theme was management and response. And here, the first part of this session was identical to the other 2. We had 2 synthesis talks, one on key legislation from a federal perspective with state consequences, and a second talk looking at Florida's water quality restoration program with an emphasis on nutrients and red tide. And then this followed with 5-minute lightning talks, again prescribed, and the Q&A panel. But this time, because we weren't really looking for management and response research priorities, we led the group through a table activity geared to objective 4, which was again making those connections between research and management. So the tables were asked, if management were a success, what would the environmental, economic, and social situation look like in 5 to 10 years? And for this to work, they had to base it in reality. And then the second question was, how do we bridge connect that research and management for the success to happen? We did have several other ways in which participants could provide information during the 3.5-day symposium, and even prior to the symposium through registration questions. We did do a roving flip chart activity, and then we also had a survey 1, 2, 3 mapping exercise. And this mapping exercise was something that the steering committee was particularly interested in, and it spoke directly to objective 2, which was identifying efforts related to nutrients and red tide. And so recognizing that there are a lot of publicly available platforms where people who are collecting monitoring data are already uploading that data. We didn't want to duplicate efforts, but we did want to inventory who is monitoring, generally where, what types of parameters, and if that data is available, how might somebody access it? Where do they go? Or who do they contact? And so this is Survey 123 is GIS based, so it's fully queryable. And we will be including the results of this survey in the white paper. So at the end of the symposium, we did conclude with an evaluation, and there were numerous questions, but the only one that I'm going to show here is this first one, which was, to what degree did we achieve our stated objectives? And for this, we used a Likert scale, so 1 being poor, 5 being excellent. And we were really pleased that for all 4 objectives, we kind of ranged in the good to excellent range. I did mention for objective 4, that was a tall task. We recognize that could be in a symposium all in itself, and I think Chuck alluded to that a little bit. So good means that we're on a good start. And in objective 3, one thing that I do want to point out is that while we went into the planning intending to prioritize the research needs, at the end of the assessment where Joy led the group through making those linkages between similarities and dependencies, we really felt that the list was condensed and focused and refined enough that prioritizing wasn't really going to benefit the process. And after proposing that to Kate, and she may have consulted with some task force members, she agreed. So we used that time elsewhere, and I think that's why that score is a little bit lower. All right, so in terms of next steps, our immediate next step was getting permission from each of our speakers to make their presentations available on our symposium website as a PDF. And I'm happy to report all of these speakers agreed, and those presentations are currently linked and available at either the website link or the QR code that you see on the screen. And then our final next step is to develop a white paper summarizing the state of the science symposium. And this is due December 31st. For this, we have a lot of resources at our disposal. We have the presentation slides. We recorded the main room, so we have video and transcripts. And our note takers took fantastic notes. We also have Post-its and flip charts that were used during the breakout activities. For session 1 and 2, we'll be following the same format as other symposium documents. So we will have narrative consensus statements summarizing what we know and what we need to know, including why we don't know it. And then that will follow with a list of our research needs. Session 3 is going to be a little bit different, and I have to be determined because we are currently writing up session 1 and 2, and we really don't want to stick our heads too much into that until we are able to really focus on session 3. But we do know that we want to tie it to that 4th objective, identifying connections to local, regional, and state management and policy interventions. And then we will also be including, where appropriate, those other input methods. And at different milestones along the way, we will be sending out drafts to our technical advisory committee, who has agreed to review. And if we need to, we will also be reaching out to speakers if we need clarification. So we do anticipate being ahead of schedule, and we're hoping to have the final white paper out before Christmas. And that is it. Thank you very much. And I will take this down so that you all can see me.
Thanks so much, Betty. That was a great overview. And thanks so much to the task force too for participating in the symposium. Again, I think that it's great to see and get a chance to have that overview, to have a little bit of perspective. And if there's any questions for Betty, I thought that it might be helpful just as a kind of follow-up to go over a little bit of the timeline and the details related to the grant call. But before I get into that, does anyone have any questions for Betty that are separate from that? Okay, I think we're really excited to see where you take these different components and how
A lot of information.
A lot of information. And a lot of what we know and a lot of what we don't know. And I think so before I give my thoughts, I will open it up for some more comments. But again, that timeline, so the white paper will be submitted, completed in December this year. And so our goal is to finalize the grant call in February of 2026. And then the deadline for applications with the RFP would be April 2026. We would have a fairly quick review process and make award decisions in May. This allows us some time to, finalize the scope of work so that we can start the contract, ideally July 1, which is the beginning of our fiscal year 2026. And then the goal is for the projects to be completed in a year and a half with a little bit of time to synthesize at the end, but for the bulk of the work to take place in an 18 months time period. And so with that in mind, the start date would be July, and then wrap in July 2026. Things would wrap up in December 31, 2027. I think Megan may go over this a little bit more. So I also wanted to mention that we're anticipating up to $600,000 per year for this. It is likely that there could be concurrent projects, and the funding can be directed or in addition. So as we think about options, I think that there may be a need for some very applied components that aren't necessarily related to going off and thinking about new ways to measure nutrients in red tide, but perhaps synthesizing some of the historical data and the data we have in hand. And so there are some clear gaps even in the presentation that Betty just shared, like with the spatial coverage. You can see it stops. And then I thought there were some really neat discussions about trying to expand that, just as an example. But data related needs, again, may be a good thing to work on. There may be some needs ahead of time. There's also the possibility to have some more of a symposium or maybe a more dedicated working group. So there's some different ways that we can move forward. And I think that, so I'll kind of pause and see if there's any other feedback from task force members about the symposium. Any questions or comments about what happens next or about the grant program? Okay. I had a few core impressions in terms of gaps that kind of stuck with me, and that spatial coverage was one where moving more into some of the areas north of where blooms typically manifest. That was something that was kind of a takeaway message for me. I think also, kind of alluding to what Chuck said, there's a lot of complexity. And I think that trying to highlight that complexity in a way that shows that we're continuing to understand more about the complexity, even if, unfortunately, the nature of tracking a bloom in basically an unconfined system is really challenging. So I think that moving forward, it will be really helpful again to have the white paper to help provide a more robust focus. But those were a few kind of standout things that that kind of stuck with me, as well as just the need for trying to pull some of that data together. And since no one else raised their hand, I'm going to keep talking. And I may even call on people, but one of the things that a recent initiative that I thought was really interesting and beneficial and might be a template to use and or think about some dovetailing was the GeoCollaborate effort that was spun up for the Indian River Lagoon for largely for the 2016 Orion lagunensis bloom that resulted in a big fish kill, and trying to pull in a lot of different types of data. And my experience, I watched a lot of the presentations, but I guess I wanted to comment on my experience more as a data provider, because I was really struck, and maybe Dwayne and Chuck were more involved in this, but the efforts to collect robust data were led by somebody who had a really strong drive to understand the data and the complexities and the nuances of environmental measurements. And I think that was really critical and commendable. And in the interviews that I participated in, again, as a provider of data, I was really impressed with the back and forth and the questions that I received. And so that's where I wondered if that might be a good template, again, with the idea of thinking about trying to collate data, not necessarily going all the way to the visualization tool. So I don't know if Chuck, if you or if anyone else maybe has any comments on that. But there may be some things we can do even leading up to the grant call, because I just think that data synthesis need is probably important. And I see Dwayne.
Yeah, I think the
Chuck never came off mute.
Yeah, I think the challenge that we saw with applying GeoCollaborate on the Indian River Lagoon was just the variability in data sets from different partners and data QA/QC coming into the system. And so there's no question that some of those data sharing and communication tools like GeoCollaborate can be very powerful, but a lot of the ability to take that information, to synthesis and then to maybe response during a bloom is challenging. It's not an easy, plug and play. We've got to have a lot more, cohesiveness among the, at least for the Indian River Lagoon, the many partners who are collecting data. There's no question the tool is, and the emerging other tools that are coming on board are going to be important in complex systems. And you had mentioned the complexity of an open system. The complexity of a closed system like the Indian River Lagoon, it's not simpler, because of the narrow, partitioning of the lagoon, our spatial boundaries, you get to be very complex, and where do you set those boundaries, both temporally and spatially? But yes, the tool, and we did provide DEP a report on that analysis, looking at both the strengths and the challenges of that particular software program in harmful algal bloom response and data sharing.
I wonder if it might be helpful to kind of see the questionnaire that the person who was in charge of reaching out to a lot of the different potential end users and data providers, to see the questionnaire that they used to kind of assess the data and get through some of the QA/QC questions, because I just remember, sometimes you're like, okay, I'm going to provide data and it's just going to go onto a website and there's no context but this person wanted the context, they wanted all the critical information that you want when you're handing over data. And so I was just really impressed with that process. And it seemed like it was a huge effort too. So that's where we may be sort of confronting similar challenges in this arena, and the process seemed like it was pretty effective.
Yeah, I think you looked at the data that we applied, in that grant, no question that the quality data was coming from, St. Johns River Water Management District, because there was, really good QA/QC oversight, on those data sets. And then when we tried to move, to other, data collectors, especially some of the real time, that there's just a huge amount of data, but those data sets did not have the same level of QA/QC. So data availability and quality on the front end becomes a really important consideration.
I watched one of those webinars and was very interested in that, but I wondered how useful it is in an event as opposed to doing it ahead of time in an area that has events, and what the kind of cost it is to really do assessing all the data that's available for a region, if you're even choosing a region that has much data. Did you have a sense of what it would cost to do that? Is it cost effective?
That's a really good question, and I can't answer it directly, other than, however you set up your spatial and temporal boundaries in the retrospective. So the hindcast, when we looked at it initially, it just wasn't practical to look at the whole lagoon. So we looked at a small part of the lagoon, and a very small time frame surrounding that 2016 Oreo umbra bloom. And that was a heavy lift, even in that small time frame. Moving that to a event response, I think becomes challenging because of the delay in the data, and the time frame of response. The blooms in the lagoon, aren't nearly as predictable as, Karenia in the Gulf, and especially on the spatial side, they're very ephemeral at times. And so being able to use a software program like that to guide, an event response and actually operationalize in the real world, where do, the boats go to pick up dead fish? Where do you deploy, large garbage bins to handle those fish? That still is problematic. So the software can be helpful, but it's not easy. And ours was just a preliminary look at the GeoCollaborate wasn't designed for harmful algal blooms. It was more, fires and, larger scale databases coming out of both federal, state, and local weather systems, where you really had, good QA/QC on data and good integration of those data sets across platforms and organizations. And we didn't have that then. And to be honest, we still don't really have that for the lagoon. And so the cost benefit is, I think, a question that everybody's got to ask. And it's one that I'm sure DEP, when we brought the report, when you look at licensing agreements, the need for, how do you handle the data that you have in hindcast, much less the data that comes in so quickly at bloom emergence. It is a challenge to decide, whether to trigger that cost, to put everybody in a unified system of data sharing, and to make the decision, is this the proper system? Does this actually work for the intended outcome that our agencies have? So we didn't answer a lot of those questions, but we posed a lot of additional questions and challenges on application.
Yeah, and actually, as you're talking, I'm contrasting that with the response to Piney Point, where the state set up the website. I don't know how effective that was. From the outside, it looked effective. From the inside, I don't know if it was or not. But I guess the question I'm asking is, did that work at a much lower cost, or did it not work?
Yeah, I can't answer that question, but clearly with an event like Piney Point, your parameters are, simplified because you have a source, and a response to that source, and with a system that, is responding to multiple stressors, at variable scales, it starts to become difficult, when you start looking at salinity, temperature, nutrient concentrations, the variability of, multiple species to respond to, these multiple stressors. It challenges the software.
I will say that with Piney Point, there was both movement on the state side to get data out there through Protecting Florida Together, but also the Tampa Bay Estuary Program. They have a long history of sharing data from Tampa Bay, and so they were able to kind of mobilize that and develop a Shiny app that pulled in information from a lot of different places. And I think that was really an invaluable tool, and having not just the event data, but the ability to see the event data relative to long-term measurements. I think that was just an amazing example of how having that structure in place can help when there is an event. Was it instantaneous? No. Anything that involves programming, it takes some time and effort. And when there's an event, trying to factor in that kind of emergency response component is probably a good idea. The circulation models had to be updated. It was kind of but definitely having the data consolidation through a Shiny app in that event was really invaluable.
So changing the subject.
Yes.
For the event response, one of the things for nutrients, I've been thinking about this for a long time, and I'm not sure that we really addressed it in that workshop, nor do we think about it much. And in freshwater systems, I think about this all the time, the idea of legacy nutrients. In marine systems, you think about nutrients buried in sediments, but the idea that because the river runoff in this particular location has been providing more nutrients over time, which is ending up in the sediment, which is then remineralized. So it's actually a riverine source, but it's gone through a recycling. And so if you're talking about, is this river and human sources of nutrients increasing and affecting Karenia, you don't think about those legacy nutrients, so to speak. We have a few measurements of benthic remineralization, and when we do the, like Cindy has, how much of the productivity is coming from this nutrient source versus that nutrient source. But we don't look at the legacy nutrients and whether in some areas they've increased over time. Is that a big enough component to worry about? But we don't talk about that, whereas in freshwater systems, they talk about legacy nutrients a lot.
And I think the sediment benthic contribution along with submarine groundwater discharge, to me, those were some areas that came out as being places where we really need more data and new data.
Yeah. But they're also changing over time. And I think that but I separate the groundwater from the benthic remineralization too, although hard to measure them separately. Yeah, just making it harder for everybody else.
Yeah.
But that was the surprising thing, I think, was the whole idea of the blue holes that may be all over the place, that could be providing nutrients at a fairly rapid rate.
In terms of just going back to the prior discussion where we were talking about GeoCollaborate and thinking about data management, I do think that some sort of effort to try to pull together a more complete nutrient and phosphate data set at a minimum could be really invaluable, and there may be some important lessons learned from the GeoCollaborate process in that. And so I wanted to see what if folks on the task force had any thoughts about whether or not that might be something valuable to try to pursue, even in advance of the white paper coming out. Or if you had any other ideas in that sort of synthesis vein of things that we might be able to do, in preparation for the grant call.
I don't know if this is possible because there's maybe just too little data. But there are all these papers, there are a number of papers about stable isotope data, which people interpret in different ways. And I have not seen a synthesis of the stable isotope data that talks about where the nutrients are coming from. And I think there are different schools. I mean that in not a specific sense, but a general sense of opinions about that. And maybe it's not an effort worth doing. Maybe there's just not enough data, or the methods are so different, or something that it just is not worth doing. But it's something that I think somebody should think about doing.
Well, kind of as a follow-up to that, one of the things that I thought would be really invaluable is, we're in June right now, and as much as I hate to say it, we're, starting to think about what might happen later this summer or fall with Karinia. And, thinking about the different types of monitoring and mapping and kind of what that looks like going into a new bloom season, where we do have some of these tools now available that we didn't have before. So with the idea that there are some different schools of thought, some different ways of measuring, some different even geographic levels of interest, I think, in terms of where people have focused a lot of their work. And so it may be, there's the idea of trying to get people together to do sort of more of an in-depth synthesis of what has been done, but maybe an outcome of that would be also to propose how to go out and really test a lot of these things, because it's pulling together expertise from a lot of different areas. And, as you just pointed out, Clay, trying to measure benthic remineralization at the same time that you have remineralization happening in the water, at the same time that you have these different nutrient sources and sinks. I think trying to come up with a system that can quantify rates in situ, or, try to get there, that might be a good goal as well, so that we have a more designed system to go out and study some of these processes.
I mean, one of the questions that to me hung over the meeting was, to what extent do these Are there maps of the blue holes? Are there ways? I gathered that sampling them directly is really difficult because they're so small individually and difficult to sample. But are there ways that you could assess the nutrient inputs by very small scale sampling just to see in an area where you think there are lots of blue holes to see if you can pick up, I don't know, nutrient plumes from them? I'm not sure what you would look for. Do cell abundances increase over blue holes if they're providing a nutrient source? I mean, that's also simplistic, I realize. And I'm sure people who know more about it could come up with something, some way to assess whether they really are the important factor that I came away with that they might be. Or if they'd already done that and decided that they're not really that big a deal.
Well, I might even kind of generalize that a bit more to say that we work on a leaky aquifer. And so, you know, having a better sense of an area that, you know, that might be a sampling gap, but trying to really follow nutrients as they move from inshore to offshore, but along, you know, what we think is one contiguous pathway. There may be numerous kind of points where there's ventilation or exchange.
And I assume there must be other markers of groundwater that, like caffeine or something like that, that could be used.
Chuck, did you want to expand on what you said earlier in terms of like how next directions or things we might be able to tackle, you know, again, as some more directed actions?
I mean, I guess for me, you know, when it comes down to, you know, trying to pin down where all the nutrients come from, I mean, you know, the things you can manage are the same ones that everybody's trying to manage at the moment, and that drives the nutrients in the groundwater, and it drives the, you know, the legacy loads. So, you know, it drives all of those things. So for me, you know, I'm not sure that understanding exactly how much contribution comes from groundwater actually changes your management. It might be a useful thing to know so that you can say to people, the legacy loads, you know, are telling us that it's going to take 20 years after we get to this point, 20 more years for the system to wind down, as it were. I guess, you know, my other kind of thought is that, I mean, it seemed like we do have a fairly decent idea that Karenia can pretty much grab any nutrient that's available if needs be, as it were, right? Organic, inorganic. So, you know, once again, you know, the answer to the question, do nutrients affect Karenia, is yes, and, you know, in multiple different ways. But again, you know, I think the only thing that we can actually deal with are the inputs that we can control ourselves, which are the ones that, you know, if anything's making it worse, those are going to be the ones that are. So that was a little bit of my concern about chasing after silver bullets, you know, saying if we could just know it was groundwater, we'd be able to fix it somehow, and you probably can't. Not by doing anything different.
The question of, and maybe you already know the answer to this, and this is my simplistic way of looking at it, the question using stable isotopes of whether the source is sewage or agriculture. And I have some doubts about whether the stable isotopes can do that. But beyond that, you already know the answer to that, and it's not a question that needs to be answered.
I don't think we do. And I mean, I think Kate's point about trying to pull together the information is a good one. You know, I think that for me, that was one of the take-home messages is, you know, there seems to be a lot more that has been pulled together recently and coming from different directions. And I think, you know, that could be of value around the nutrient question, you know, as we try to to think about any video or whatever, that would be a useful thing to have, is to really get the nuts and bolts pulled together to see what it looks like. You're absolutely right, though, that stable isotopes are going to struggle on their own to separate out a lot of these sources because they overlap. And it's and again,
Yeah.
it's a mixing thing, right? So,
Mhm.
it's not an either or, it's a mix. So when you put hot water and cold water together, you get warm water, so.
But
That's
if you
what
use stable isotopes in combination with other compounds that indicate human sources, perhaps
Possible.
that gets you there.
Possible. I mean, again, I think it can help.
Well, I think taking it back to what those isotopes can fingerprint, which probably is watershed or regional, like, sub-region scale, it may be helpful for when you think about a bloom that kind of starts in one area and then moves to all of these other areas as in interacting with outflow from multiple watersheds. It may be a way to help track the bloom's interaction, beyond where it starts. And so I think like a lot of the impetus for trying to connect blooms and nutrients, a lot of that has been tied into the Caloosahatchee system. But I think that it's important to recognize that there's a lot of other riverine systems that are contributing nutrients, and I think there's work that's going into kind of sorting that out. But having a better opportunity to fingerprint that. And I still think taking it to the scale of, we have seasonal processes and we have a bloom cycle. And so if we can align management with those two things, it might be really helpful. There may be some new opportunities there. Rhonda?
Clay, you're on the right track, and that's why I kept asking if anybody was doing any kind of isotopes on the bloom itself. Like, what is the cell incorporating? What isotope is it incorporating? Because they do overlap. But I think if we can find out, what those fingerprints are within the bloom, and those could change as that bloom moves down the coast, it finds a different source. But it helps from a management standpoint, absolutely, to know if that isotope nitrogen is coming from, let's say, reuse water, because right now the focus on reuse water is just that it's runoff, from surface, like it's overspray. And what I'm finding in my data, because we're using sucralose as an additional tracer, is that there's far more sucralose in the groundwater. So just the fact that you're using reuse to irrigate, it's going to groundwater, which means there are absolutely nutrients going to groundwater. And down here, groundwater goes to surface water. So it does help tie in that mechanism for management, at least for me, to know where those are coming from, where those isotopes are coming from.
So I guess the first question is, what are the best things to use for this purpose? And I am not, this is not my area of expertise, so I'm sure there are others. There was the person who gave a talk several meetings ago. Maybe there are other isotopes that would help.
There are.
Yeah.
There's a lot that fingerprint groundwater itself, and then fingerprint further the age of groundwater. And is the groundwater that we're seeing coming up, is it even from Florida? It could be from somewhere else. It could be a deep enough aquifer that any management we do in Florida isn't having an effect because that groundwater's coming from somewhere else, upstream in another state. So it takes the right combination, and unfortunately it's very expensive, and most research doesn't include all of that to be able to fine tune and point that finger.
And we did have Angie Knapp from TAMU and Kristen Beck from Oregon State and USF present, and they're using trace metals in coordination with nutrient isotope signatures to help look at sources on sort of from a macro scale, kind of thinking about Atlantic versus Gulf water and different signatures, but then also trying to dial that down to more of the estuary to estuary scale. And that work is supported in part through the Center for Red Tide Research, but also through a large NSF project that involves a lot of other collaborators. So we're fortunate to have a lot of that work kind of going on simultaneously. And I think, you know, some takeaway from the discussion that I'm hearing is that I do think that kind of coming up with whether it's an event response plan or some guidance related to sampling, in so much as it should try to address, you know, on some level, some of these things, recognizing that they may not have been addressed previously because they are incredibly challenging. But I still think that it's helpful to have that because we can chip away at things over time or have some targeted studies potentially. Okay, so we are coming up at 2:30. We're going to have our public comment period. After that, we're going to have a short break. And then we'll come back and we'll finish up some of the discussion about nutrients and next steps, and then we'll descend into some of our other discussion topics, namely thinking about how we might handle other HABs. And before we talk about that, a quick overview of some of the red tide treatment and initiation work and how we might respond to that. So just wanted to give a 4-minute warning, didn't want to stifle any of the good discussion about nutrients. But maybe it's a good time to kind of synthesize. So it seems like there's some historical data needs. There's some new data needs, and there's some consideration of maybe how to sample complex processes. And I think, Chuck, going back to your point, when we started to think about a nutrient SOS, we had to very quickly draw some boundaries to constrain it to estuaries and outward because of the scale and scope of moving further inland. But I do think that that can be a good future objective, and we really have to be mindful of that, although we can draw these artificial boundaries, those don't exist in nature. And so part of tackling the complexity of nutrients, I think, does embrace trying to figure out, you know, that next step in terms of geography as well, and how to better connect those worlds. Formidable task. Okay, so again, at 2:30, we'll go to public comment, and Jess is standing by for that. Any final comments or remarks on nutrients or the state of the science? Betty, do you have any questions or comments? I just want to say thanks again to Betty for presenting and for all of her, Lisa and Joy's efforts in terms of getting the symposium put together. It was really a remarkable job, and I really enjoyed participating in it. And so I just extremely thankful for that effort. Okay, let's go ahead and put the public comment slide up. And so I don't know if we've received any public comments, but we have posted the call-in number and we are accepting any comments as soon as it is, well, now. And we will give it about 5 minutes. And then we will go to break. And if anything comes in while we're on break, we can respond to it right when we get back. Okay, I am going to go ahead and give us a 10-minute break. If the task force members could please come back at 2:45, and I will see you all in just a minute. Thanks so much. Okay, thanks everyone for joining us again. So I wanted to talk about a few other issues before we wrap up today and think about our next meeting. The first, so you may recall following our last task force meeting, we had Liz Longstreet present on progress through the Red Tide Technology Development Initiative that Moat is leading. And I think it was a great overview and a great chance for discussion. And one of the follow-up points from that meeting was a request solicitation for feedback to help guide some of the field trials. And with that initiative, there are a series of different tiers that products or treatments move through, with that final testing step being implementation in the field. And so there's a lot of effort of that program to try to work through some of the challenges and hurdles and some of the basic steps to try to accomplish that goal. And so I just wanted to remind folks that we did provide feedback to that. At our prior task force meeting, we discussed since that program has matured, there's also the federal incubator funded through NOAA that folks at Moat and the University of Maryland have. There are other PCM HAB efforts that NOAA is funding, including a clay study that Don is the lead PI on that we're involved with. So there's a lot going on in this arena at this point. And so in addition to the kind of informal feedback that we provided as public comment to the initiative to Kevin and Liz, Kevin Claridge and Liz, we also had discussed potentially providing some recommendations ourselves as a task force. And I think that that's a good future step to work on. And again, the time is right to start reviewing some of that effort, but also making some steps to ensure that best practices are utilized moving forward. And so in a vein somewhat similar to our communications working group, and our HAB health working group, it seems like there's enough momentum, enough interest, and enough energy within this field that it might be a good segue to branch off and form another working group. And so this is something that we have had a preliminary discussion, and we'll be working through a bit of the process. Megan and I met with Don Anderson and Dale Laughinghouse to think about that working group, and we solicited some feedback from them to help guide some next steps. And so I think we'll be able to share more with the task force at a future meeting. But I just wanted to mention that we're taking advantage of that momentum, embracing it. And I think that set of preliminary comments, which was really thorough, it provides a good template for thinking about how and where we may be able to provide feedback moving forward. And so I just wanted to thank you, those of you that contributed to that, and then also just kind of mention that that is still a priority, something that we're working on, and we'll hear more from that in the future. Given that there are some lessons to be learned and some parallels with the DEP Innovative Tech Program, we've invited Ed Smith to present. Unfortunately, he couldn't come to this task force meeting, but he'll present at the next task force meeting so that we can get more of a sense of how that program for treatment is managed at the state level. And so I'm really excited to hear from Ed on that. I will pause and see if there's any questions or comments from the task force along those lines.
Well, I guess
Don?
I'll just make one comment that I think we do need something and some oversight. I have heard that there's a plan to try to do some sort of offshore testing if the red tide occurs this fall. and I'm not sure how it's going to be done or exactly the products that will be used, but you can imagine it's going to be quite prominent in the news, and there's a lot could be gained and a lot could be lost, and if it's not done properly and without at least some potential oversight, whether it's from the task force or some other group.
Yeah, I think that with the movement to try to get some of these technologies out in the field, again, I think it's a good time to think about best practices. And that's something that we really can do as a community. And as much as it seems like a lot of stuff is happening in Florida, and it is, there's a long history of treatment in freshwater systems, and marine systems and other places. So I think there's some good opportunity to think about, again, trying to make sure that we're using best practices, that we have some standard operating procedures, and even down to how information is reported and shared, because communication is such a big part of harmful algal blooms in general, but also this kind of work. And so I think that at the next meeting, we'll have more of we may be able to have a presentation even from this working group with some, a basic sense of their first goals. But I thank Don and Dale and Megan for a really good discussion about how we might move that forward. Any other questions or comments from the task force? Okay. I wanted to move into another topic that we've discussed in prior meetings, and as the HAB task force, we have decided to primarily focus initially on red tide issues, and that's something that we've been doing for the last several years. And then we have never strayed too far from the idea that there are obviously other HABs out there that we should focus on as well. But red tide is such a big issue with so many different confounding factors and nuances that it was really important to try to tackle some of those issues first. And we have discussed kind of having a primer that just goes into some of the other HAB issues in Florida, and still primarily focused, I think, at least based on our prior discussions on marine and estuarine issues. So Dave is not here to try to either stick in freshwater or support leaving it out. But I think that's something that we can continue to discuss. Does anyone have any strong feelings about, and again, just to kind of cover, this is intended to help guide and inform new policymakers, and potentially even people that are new to HABs in Florida, but working on water quality issues, working in various state, county, local departments. So it's just kind of a good overview of some of the HAB issues in Florida, across Florida, and the various potential risks that may be associated with them. Okay. I think that, yes, Quay.
Sorry, I couldn't get my hand up fast enough. This South Florida report that
Yes.
we have been discussing off and on now for years. With the new administration, a decision has been made to publish it as a white paper, the original one, which is basically what you're talking about, and then do a shortened version, which is what's going to go to Congress. The trouble is, at the timeline again, it still has to go through, I think, at least NOAA approval to go up as a white paper. And Bridget and I are facing the fact that now it's been so many years that we have to update it, which is distressing. And so I don't know, I feel really bad to see all these people going to all this trouble, but I can't promise it's going to come out anytime soon, as you all know. And so, what to do about this?
Well, I think that there's a few ways to tackle it, and we always have new and recurring HAB issues. And one of the things that we have made for some of the ones that cause public health issues are these fact sheets. So we have a Karinia fact sheet, a Pseudonychia fact sheet, and a Pyridinium fact sheet. And in just sort of in the vein of this discussion, but also thinking about how often we point to these as in response to a number of different questions. I think that we can prioritize creating some additional fact sheets for some of the organisms that we don't currently have. And I think that is a really invaluable tool that ties into something. The primer can be as simple or as complex as we want it to be. It sounds like there's already a good complex primer out there that, may need to be updated. And so I think for this, trying to focus on something that is kind of short and sweet and highlights the issues both spatially, but also in a really nice visual way. I can share some examples of what I can come up with that are not even remarkably worth putting out there, but I think we have wonderful people like Jessica that can take, my sort of bleh and turn it into a beautiful graphic that makes sense and highlights, all the things that we're trying to express. But we definitely do have some maps that, even we presented last week at a meeting that highlight some of the different issues that we've been tracking over the past 5 to 10 years. puts out, the National HAB office puts out these country, sort of the whole state perspective of HAB issues, and Florida's in there, but it doesn't necessarily include all of the different things that we might include that that we might respond to. So I think at least having that sort of updated sense of who the players are and where they occur, I think is kind of where we landed for this. And that sort of, whether or not there's a complementary sort of virtual tool or, something that can be clicked on, I think that might be really helpful. But in terms of what we've discussed in the past, Pyridinium, pelagic cyanos, Florida Bay, Indian River Lagoon, benthic cyanobacteria, Pseudonychia, sargassum, and more. So trying to put that into a bit of a primer. I think we can. Quay, would you and Bridget, when do you have a sense of when the shorter version might be prioritized, like the highlight? It would be great to have those go hand in hand as much as possible. I don't know if we could work with the national office to kind of tweak their map and come up with something that we can all use.
Let's discuss this perhaps offline maybe and see
Okay.
what we can come up with.
Because I think if we can come up with a visual template as sort of a first step, and then also work on some of these overviews of the HAB issues, I think those two go hand in hand, where ultimately we put them together into a little bit of a guide. I definitely don't want it to step on toes or,
I'm not worried about stepping on toes. I'm more concerned that somebody will have to go to a lot of work that has actually already been done.
Well, we'll try to merge it with things that we have to do anyway, like the fact sheets.
Yeah. So we can talk about this offline.
Okay. Dwayne? Oops, you're muted.
Sorry. I'm going to put my plug in for a fact sheet on Oreo umbra, primarily because of the, the impacts, the ecophysiological impacts of that species, especially on the Indian River Lagoon with the manatee unusual mortality event, over 40,000 acres of seagrass loss. And, it's in the system. We're having some bloom conditions now. Thankfully, they're, still relatively, even though they're intense, they're relatively small in spatial distribution, but relatively, damaging when they do occur. So I think that's going to be a good fact sheet.
I would argue for Ciguatera, particularly after the spinning fish. But even before that, I would have.
Yeah, and we do have a Gamberdiscus. And there are Ciguatera, there's communication material available for that. Emily?
For Ciguatera, there's an old Ciguatera rat card. I don't know who worked on it, but I have it, and we have a new staff member for the aquatic toxins program, and we were getting him to work on updating it, and so we just started it. It's totally in the baby steps, so we'll introduce it to you guys and other state agencies. But yeah, we want, maybe it's not a fact sheet, but just wanted to throw that out there that we want to put out a new Ciguatera rat card.
So maybe the fact sheets and the rock cards and the primer can all sort of dovetail in a beautiful way. And then that all fits into the South Florida assessment. And everything is linked, in Google. Probably won't be quite that seamless, but I do think that there's again, it's good to capture the momentum and to do these things in concert. So we'll follow up with you, Quay, and then also Emily and Megan. Maybe we can think about rat cards and fact sheets for other HABs and kind of come up with a plan, a proposed plan for that. And we might be able to kind of mock it up for a few things. Okay, I don't think it'll be a lot of extra work. So like we're talking about these other HABs and reporting on them and communicating about them all the time. So it's more consolidating information that we already have.
And have you seen the great graphic that NOAA has done about sargassum?
Maybe not.
I will put it in the. I have to look it up in the chat when I find it. It's in English and Spanish too, which is handy.
And so I think that ultimately this is great because it helps meet a few different communication objectives. So not just hitting policy stakeholders, but also taking it forward to communication with the public, which I think is really invaluable and helps kind of close that loop. It seems like some of these efforts are kind of moving along. And so I'd like to continue to kind of have these meetings and make some progress. And then maybe we can present again at the next task force meeting and give an update and potentially even mock up a few things just to kind of show how connected they might be across these different products and tools. And there may be some chances to kind of work through that in the communications working group as well. Any other comments on or questions about the primer? Okay. I wanted to kind of wrap up, and I'm going to hand it off to Megan to go over a little bit more about our timeline, and then also to start to think about some of our meeting dates for the next year, just as a reminder, because we have work on a lot of different efforts as well as working groups. We've moved to a biannual meeting structure for the task force. And so I'll turn it over to Megan to kind of walk us through the next parts of that before I get too far.
Okay. Oh, that was I didn't know I was covering all this.
Sorry,
That's
Megan.
okay. I'm familiar, and I'm happy to. I think that Kate covered the grants timeline well, but I will just walk through it again just to remind people of what that process looks like and what our timeline is. Hopefully that's coming through right now. So the grant timeline, we'll get that white paper. The deadline for it that Betty was talking to from the Nutrient State of the Science Symposium is in December. So we'll have it in hand in January or it'll be publicly available in January. I'm hoping with the biannual meetings, like Kate said, that we can find a fall date and a spring date to best serve that for 2026. That would be February, because then we could discuss the scope of work for that grants call related to nutrients. As Kate mentioned, we can do targeted or open calls. We anticipate doing a call for proposals. The purse is usually around 600,000. So we would, the idea is to discuss in February, have the call out in February, March, with the deadline late March, early April, have proposal reviews happen during April, and then the FWI Grants Committee is the final determinant because it comes under one of our state agency rules. And then award notices would go out just before they initiated in for the fiscal year starting July 1 and looking at an 18-month cycle is how we normally do it through December 2027. And I just sort of gave the highlights of the roles in this, because as mentioned, as you know, in the past, from the past ones, this is a grants program that falls under state rule. So the task force helps guide the call for proposals. They help guide the scope of that. And it's specifically designed to help forward recommendations of the task force. So it will be within those priority identified recommendations. We also ask you to, if you fall into, we ask you to participate as external reviewers, but also identify potential external reviewers for it. And then on the agency side, we'll prepare and manage the call and coordinate those grant review panels, as well as FWRI Grants Committee review, and notify awardees and manage those awards when they go forward. And I did just have one slide if people want a refresher on what the rule, how that looks in terms of rule. Arrows work, there we go. So it does provide us the structure that we need for the grants program. It does say that the call for proposals needs to identify what the specifics are in terms of the type of award that'll be met, if it's a grant or contract, the scope of it, what the funding ranges are, and what the time period is for them. We do need to have review panels. So we have multi-institutional review panels. That is what we're asking you to participate in and help identify some members to expert reviewers to assist with that. To review and rank proposal, how we've done that in the past is normally first initially sending it to different members for blind ranking, and then we consolidate the scores and we have a meeting as a committee to discuss and have an opportunity to change rankings if necessary. Then those recommendations and scorings go to our FWRI grants committee, and they basically accept. I guess they could deny, but they defer to the experts and review and accept those recommendations unless there are some areas of concern that we're not aware of or something else that hasn't been addressed. And then we initiate the grant agreements and we apply through the grants program. We can have a 60-day pre-award allowance. So even though you saw that tight time frame of review and award announcements happening in May, June with a July 1st start date, the agreement doesn't have to necessarily be executed until 60 days. So sometime before September, and the work can still begin on July 1. 1st May. So that was the refresher. Any questions? Most of you've all participated in that in some capacity in past years. It's pretty straightforward. It's a pretty standard practice. We wouldn't determine that scope and sort of directed categories of the call until the spring meeting or the New Year meeting. Once we have the white paper.
And so for our next meeting schedule, we were targeting probably like a fall meeting and a spring meeting for the task force. So the fall meeting would be before the white paper and the spring meeting would be after the white paper, just to kind of put that all together. And then the call for proposals is right in the middle. So that September meeting or fall meeting would be a chance for us to provide a little bit more insight into the call for proposals. But Megan, do we need to have another like check-in that?
Well, ideally, based on, I'm just thinking, and this is sort of selfishly from the state perspective and in terms of our sort of deadlines and granting periods and quarters, it would ideally we would have a September meeting and a February meeting. But I wanted to just bring it up to, I will send exact dates, but open up in case there's something I'm missing within your respective communities or professions that make those months very troublesome. Well, I'm not hearing it, so I will send some potential dates for that. And then those will be the full person, the in-person full day meetings. It still leaves us the flexibility to call virtual meetings as needed to discuss things. At the moment, I don't believe there's anything pressing, but they could come up as events or different things come forward, and we would still open that up and we could still host a virtual publicly noticed meeting as needed. I think that covers what you mentioned, Kate.
When do we get to provide insight and like from the white paper? When do we have that discussion?
So we'll have it in hand in January, so the detailed discussion can be at the February meeting.
Got it.
Yeah,
Just wanted to make sure I saw that relative to everything else. Okay.
I believe we get it by the end of January, so we wouldn't want to schedule the February meeting until mid-February to allow everyone a couple of weeks to review and consider items for discussion at the meeting. But that will give at least 2 weeks.
Okay. So we will be reaching out then for dates probably in September and February for our next in-person task force meetings. And if you have things that you would like to see in a future agenda, please reach out to Megan. And we already have some things that we've identified here, including having a presentation from Ed Smith, and then continued updates on progress with a lot of these ongoing initiatives. So with that, I'll pause and see if anyone has any final comments or questions before we wrap up today's meeting. Okay, well, we'll be in touch again with that timeline, a little bit more clarification, how everything fits together. And I look forward to seeing everyone again as a task force in September. Thank you for your contributions, and it's great to see all of you. Very appreciative for your efforts here. Thank you.
Thanks, Kate. Thanks, Megan. Jessica.
Thanks, Jessica.
Thanks.
I always